This episode of History is brought to you by Peter Lauer, this week's newest patron. I'm going to tell you a story about a ship that wasn't just shipwrecked, a ship that was stolen, a ship that changed countries and changed names, a ship that was used to scam the insurance company twice, a ship that was shipwrecked again, a ship that was discovered sailing itself home in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean with no crew and no captain, full of its cargo and food, no souls aboard. This week on History, the greatest ghost ship mystery of them all, the Mary Celeste. Before this ship was stolen, before it was shipwrecked multiple times, before it changed countries, even before it crashed into and sunk another ship in traffic, before it was even called the Mary Celeste, this ship got off to a pretty rocky start. Sailors are a superstitious people, and it's a wonder that this ship ever sailed at all. In the early 1800s, goods were shipping all over the world, and the Atlantic was regularly crisscrossed by wooden sailing ships going between Europe and Africa and North America. It was an amazing time for maritime navigation and seamanship. And a lot of these ships were built on the east coast of what would be Canada, in the Bay of Fundy. Coastal schooners sailed up and down the east coast of North America, moving goods and people. A man called Joshua Dewis was a shipbuilder in the area, and he was making his break away from the smaller schooners that he had been building to make a much bigger, a much vaster brigantine-rigged ship that he would use to cross the Atlantic. Dewis needed lumber for his new ship that he wanted to build, and he needed a lot of it. So he contacted Jacob and Isaac Spicer. These are two brothers who owned the woodland around a town called Spencer's Island. And the deal was Dewis would give them 1/4 ownership of the boat if they supplied the lumber. Now, there was a ton of money to be made in the sailing and shipping industry at the time, so the Spicer brothers agreed to the deal pretty quickly, and the keel for the new Atlantic crossing ship was laid on the beach right there in Spencer's Island in 1860. And the site of this shipbuilding beach didn't even have a wood mill, so the trees were basically cut down, dragged out to the beach, and then shaped with axes and saws. When the ship was finished, it was some 99 feet long and 25 feet of beam, or 25 feet wide, and 198 tons in all. She would have 2 masts with a brigantine rig, which has square sails on the main mast, supported by lateen or gaff-rigged sails fore and aft of that, and the ship would be dubbed the Amazon. Finally completed and launched, the Amazon would be 75% owned by its builder, Joshua Dewis, and then 25% owned by the brothers that supplied the wood, Jacob and Isaac Spicer, and a captain needed to be hired to make the first voyage, which was a planned trip across the Atlantic carrying local lumber to sell. The first leg was to sail the Amazon from where it launched at Spencer's Beach to 5 islands nearby to pick up that lumber. They hired a captain, a man called McClellan, who was actually already sick when they weighed anchor for the first time to get underway. He had thought that once they got out there, the sea air would relieve his symptoms, but just a few miles into the journey, he was so sick that the first mate turned the Amazon around and put back in at Spencer's Island, where the ship had been built. A few days later, McClellan died from pneumonia in the Spicer brothers' family home. His body was loaded back onto the Amazon, though, to be sailed to his hometown a few miles away, a place called Economy. So Captain McClellan was just newly married before all this, and when his new wife saw her husband's new ship approaching the town, didn't really make sense. He was to be gone for months on this Atlantic crossing, so she rushed down to the dock to greet the ship, only to find out the terrible news of her husband's death. And so the story of the ship begins, with her first successful delivery of cargo being that of her captain's remains. The rocky start for the ship was bad, but business must go on. So a new captain was hired, a man called Jack Parker, and his job was to carry on, to take the ship to London with the load of timber that was planned. The first stop of that journey would be to head down south to Eastport, Maine, to supply before taking off across the ocean. But on the way into the harbor in Maine, she snared a bunch of fishing wires and was damaged and had to sit at anchor for several days while they repaired it. But finally, Jack Parker took the Amazon out to sea with the load of lumber, and he crossed the mighty Atlantic, arriving safely in London, even after all those mishaps. The lumber was unloaded, and as the shipping industry does to stay profitable, a new load of cargo was picked up right there in London, and it was destined for Portugal. They sailed down the Thames and out into the Strait of Dover, where the Amazon promptly went wrong again. She collided with a British brig, and she hit the brig so hard that it started sinking immediately. The crew of the Amazon quickly rescued all of the crew of the brig, of course, as those guys abandoned their ship, and the Amazon sailed them safely into nearby Dover, when their ship was just disappearing beneath the waves. The Amazon spent some time in Dover, where the damage from the crash was assessed and repaired. This was her second time being delayed for repairs on her second voyage. She then sailed on to Portugal and delivered her cargo. For several years, the Amazon sailed, and things got a lot better. She would sail the Mediterranean, running cargo frequently and crisscrossing the Atlantic, returning home from time to time. And eventually, Captain Jack Parker, after all that success, moved on with his career, and a new captain was hired for the Amazon, a man called William Thompson. And this is the guy that would steal the boat. History is a brand new channel on YouTube, and if you like it, please give the video a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. It's free for you, and it would really mean the world to me. Subscribing inspires me to keep making these videos for you, and if you could, please leave a comment below and let me know what the next video should be about. It was the fall of 1867. The ship was some 6 years old now. Captain William Thompson had been piloting the Amazon all over the world without really much issue, but the owners of the ship, the Spicer brothers, who provided the wood, and Joshua Dewis, who did the building, they were getting less satisfied with the captain's performance, and they hatched a plan to replace him. Try to imagine replacing the captain, who has full control over your cash cow of an Atlantic sailing cargo ship. It's sort of a delicate procedure. He is, after all, the man seeing to the safety of your huge investment, and it's not really easy to pin him down. I mean, he travels the world for a living. The owners hatched a plan. Captain Thompson had just piloted the Amazon to Baltimore to pick up a load of corn, and he was due to drop it off in Halifax, so they sent a messenger to meet him in Halifax when he arrived. And the message was to hold the ship there at dock in Halifax because a new captain was coming. And Halifax is interesting because it's the highest north the ship could go during the winter months for insurance reasons. The same is true today. If your boat is insured, which the Amazon was, the insurance company will routinely tell you where and when that you're allowed to sail the boat. A great example of this today is the Caribbean. While many sailboat owners enjoy sailing through the tropical paradise, they aren't allowed to be there from July to November during hurricane season. And if they stay and the boat gets wrecked, the insurance won't pay out. The same is true in the time of the Amazon for Cape Breton Island, just north of Halifax. The insurance company made very clear to the owners of the Amazon that she was not to be up there after November 1st. Now, Captain Thompson arrived in Halifax as planned just before November, and he got the news that he was to be replaced. And he set his own plan in motion. First, one of his crew members was George Spicer. Name probably sounds familiar. He's the son of one of the owners. George had been crewing on the Amazon from the beginning and would obviously be loyal to the owners, the Spicer brothers. So Captain Thompson immediately expelled him from the ship, right there in Halifax. Then Captain Thompson left the safety of the Halifax dock and sailed precisely where he wasn't allowed to go, straight up to Cape Breton Island. And now, after November 1st, he anchored off Cape Breton, now on the Lamb. The owners had no idea what was going on. They didn't know where he went. He and the Amazon had just disappeared. Days went by with no word of him or the vessel when a message finally arrived to the owners. The message was from Captain Thompson. The message explained that he was going for a load of coal that they didn't know about, I guess. And while anchored off Cape Breton, where he shouldn't have been, a strong winter gale came up, as they do, and it forced the Amazon to be wrecked on the beach. And he explained that the ship had been so severely crippled that it would need major repairs, expensive repairs, if it were to ever be floated again. And the owners went into battle with the insurance company, of course, to try and get funds to go and salvage their ship. But of course, the insurance company refused to pay. They specifically stated that the ship should not be up there this far into November. With the owners, the Spicer brothers and the ship's builder Joshua Dewis, they were left with no choice. They declared the ship abandoned, and they moved on with some of the other ships that they had been building at Spencer's Island. The Amazon was just the first ship that they intended for their business venture. And Captain Thompson's claim of the ship wrecking, right after he was essentially fired and then stole the ship, all seems a bit weird, but it gets even weirder. Suspiciously, soon after the ship was declared abandoned by the owners, the Amazon was claimed by a new owner, a man called Alexander McBean. And it gets even more suspicious. McBean, just a week after claiming salvage and new ownership of this shipwrecked Amazon, registered it in a new home port, the town of Sydney, in Nova Scotia. Now, the law at the time said that the registration of a ship can't change unless the ship is in seaworthy condition. And if the Amazon had been wrecked on the beach, he shouldn't have been able to register it without first fixing it in just a week. Or he somehow lied sufficiently enough to the registry office in Sydney. But to make matters worse, right after the ship was registered by McBean, it was sold. A brand new owner immediately registered the Amazon right away, a man called John Beatty. The whole thing was a mess, and the town of Spencer's Island was left crippled by the loss of the income. And Captain Thompson had somehow stolen the ship right from under them and then sold it for his own profit to this McBean guy, who I guess sold it to this Beatty guy who now owned it. I guess they were right to want to fire this captain in the first place. They must have known something was up with him. The Amazon disappears for about a year after this whole mess, and then records finally turn up for her south of where she was last sighted in Canada. Now she's in Maine, not delivering cargo or anchored in some harbor. She was found shipwrecked. Again, or for real this time, and she was again declared abandoned. Now, some salvagers found her wrecked in Maine, and they managed to pump the water out of her and refloat her. And they took her under tow, and they towed her down to New York, where they put her up in an auction to try and get some money for their efforts. And they did. They were able to sell her. A man called Richard Haynes bought her for some $1,750. Things kind of get complicated for the Amazon now. Just as it works today, if you bring a Canadian-flagged vessel into the U.S., you have to pay an import duty on it. It usually works that way between two countries. And Haynes didn't want to pay that import duty, so he made some repairs that he said the ship needed, and he slapped a new name on the back. Haynes had planned to put her into the cargo service industry under the new name and have her sail all over the world, again under his ownership now, never having paid the import tax on her, all while hoping that nobody would really notice. And the name that he put on the back was the Mary Celeste. History is brought to you by patrons, people who give a couple of bucks an episode to make these videos possible. I couldn't do it without you guys. If you'd like to help out History, please consider becoming a patron. Patrons get access to the videos early and live streams, and they get to play a part in the discussion on what videos we'll be making next. Now, Haynes tried to fool the government to avoid that import fee, but of course, the tax man showed up asking for the fees from importing the Canadian vessel into the US. And Haynes argued. He said when he bought it, it was so shipwrecked that it needed a huge amount of work. He had rebuilt the keel, new ribs, new planking, new deck, the whole stern of the ship had to be rebuilt. And he reasoned with the tax man that he had replaced most of the ship, totaling at least twice as much the cost it would have been to build a whole new ship. So he shouldn't have to pay an import tax on a ship that was basically built new in the US, not in Canada. And it would later seem like he might be lying about all that work that he did. Stay tuned. Haynes, without paying those taxes he just refused, with the new ship dubbed the Mary Celeste, put her into service, and within less than the first year of his business venture with her, he went bankrupt, and when he couldn't pay his bills, the ship was seized and put up for sale again. Enter James Winchester, a former sea captain himself. He found the ship for sale after being seized, and he bought it fairly cheap. It was an American registered brigantine, as far as he knew. And right after he bought it, the taxman came knocking to visit Winchester. And he explained that the Mary Celeste was formerly the Amazon, a Canadian vessel, and the import tax was never paid. The taxman offered to drop the case if Winchester would just pay him cash right there on the spot. Of course, it was a shakedown, and Winchester refused because he had no knowledge of the past of this boat and that it was a Canadian vessel and no one paid the duty. So he refused to pay. The taxman tried to seize the ship, and the case went to court, and ultimately Winchester eventually ended up winning, never having to pay the import tax at all. But it wasn't all winning for Winchester. When he set to get to the Mary Celeste and get her ready for service, he found out quickly that the ship was a wreck. Apparently, when Haynes had claimed to have rebuilt almost the whole ship, he was lying because everything needed to be replaced. It's almost as if Haynes was claiming to have replaced everything that was broken, and he had that list of things that were broken because they were still broken. Winchester doubled down on his investment, though, and instead of just fixing her up, he took through a major refit. She was stripped right to the waterline and rebuilt stronger and bigger, adding a whole additional deck and upgrading the whole rig. With all the new additions and repairs, the ship's tonnage actually went from 198 tons to 282. This was obviously a major overhaul, an expensive one, and to raise the funds, Winchester put 1/3 of the boat up for sale. If he could bring in a partial owner, then he could help with the funding but maintain control of the ship. And the man who bought the 1/3 was the legendary Benjamin Spooner Briggs. Briggs was kind of an American legend. His ancestors had come over on the Mayflower. Some of his family fought in the American Revolution. Briggs had spent much of his own life at sea and was very well respected for his abilities and his fairness as a leader. He captained the brigantine Seafoam and the schooner Forest King, as well as the Arthur. This was just the man that Winchester needed to own 1/3 of his new ship and captain it so they could start making money after all that they had invested in this refit. And Briggs was a family man, and he insisted that on his first voyage on the Mary Celeste, that his family would come with him. His childhood sweetheart, now wife, Sarah Briggs, and their daughter, 2-year-old Sophie. They had a son too. He was 8, but he was in school, so he couldn't come. The first voyage she was hired for was scheduled to go to Italy with a complement of 10 people aboard. Other than the Briggs family, the first mate, second mate, cook, and crewman, as well as the ship's cat. The Mary Celeste moored in New York at Pier 50, and she was made ready for yet another Atlantic crossing in her career, this time after a big refit. After all she'd been through to this point, the shipwrecks, being stolen, being chased by the taxman, moved to a new country and renamed and then completely rebuilt, she seemed poised to get underway. Within just a few days of leaving the planned departure date, the Briggs family started calling the Mary Celeste their home. They started staying on her at the New York pier, and they got resupplied, and they waited to depart. The ship was loaded up with 1,701 barrels of alcohol that were destined for Italy, and as the crew arrived, they arranged to be towed down the Hudson to the waiting New York harbor. On Tuesday, November 5th, their tow ship arrived, and they set out from the pier. She was towed down to Staten Island at the mouth of the harbor, where the ship would usually lose the tow, put up her sails, and get underway under her own power. But the weather was less than ideal. A heavy fog had rolled in, as it does on the New York harbor, and in the interest of safety, Captain Briggs opted to anchor off Staten Island, wait for a better window. Sarah Briggs used the opportunity to send one last letter home to her mother-in-law before they departed, but soon after, the weather cleared and the Mary Celeste set out of the harbor into the ocean due west for Italy. While the Mary Celeste had been waiting at the New York pier, another ship laid waiting as well. Across the Hudson, not far away on the New Jersey side, was the De Gratia, another Canadian-built brigantine ship, also loaded up to cross the Atlantic. The De Gratia was similar but slightly smaller, not as fast as the Mary Celeste, though equally capable of making the crossing safely. Captain Morehouse of the De Gratia had his crew readied and cargo secured, but was well behind the Mary Celeste. He didn't leave New York until November 15th, 10 days later. The De Gratia logged that from the time they left New York Harbor, they had bad weather every single day. Storms and high winds caused them to keep the hatches battened down. The seas out of New York get rough as you reach the Gulf Stream, and the crossing can be fairly rough when the weather kicks up. The De Gratia, some 15 days at sea through storms and rain and high winds, finally sighted the Azores, a group of islands more than halfway across from New York to Portugal. A welcome sight amidst the storm as a safe place to land if things were going wrong. But things were going well for the De Gratia, and the weather was clearing, making for smoother sailing, and she sailed past the Azores to the south, continuing her journey toward Gibraltar. It was December 5th, almost a month into the crossing, and Captain Morehouse and crew were excited to be nearing the end of what was a miserable and wet and stormy crossing. Well past the Azores and out of sight of any land is when they spotted it. "Sails," called a crewman. Captain Morehouse took to his glass and zoned in on the sails on the horizon. A ship, a brigantine-rigged ship, headed straight toward them. It wouldn't have been uncommon, as ships routinely crisscross each other on the Atlantic, especially on approach to the Gibraltar Strait, such a busy shipping channel. But this ship headed toward them was sailing erratically, and as they approached, they could see that it wasn't even at full canvas. Not all the sails were up. Some of the sails had been taken down, and it appeared as though, from her behavior, that no one was actually at the helm, or at least she wasn't intentionally being piloted. Captain Morehouse sailed the De Gratia toward the mysterious ship cautiously. Although pirates had been a big problem 100 years later, it was still prudent to be cautious with a valuable ship full of cargo. As they approached the similar-looking vessel to theirs and sailed alongside, they noted that no one was on deck or at the helm. She was sailing herself, under reduced sail, and they were easily able to keep pace with her, even though they were a slower ship. They hailed over and over and over again, but no one answered them. It was when they circled around behind the ghost ship that they saw the name scrawled across the stern, the Mary Celeste. Captain Morehouse ordered his first and second mates to take a lifeboat and row over to see what was going on with this ship. In the laws of maritime salvage, which likely would have been crossing Captain Morehouse's mind at this point, if you find an abandoned ship like this and surrender it to authorities, the company that insures the ship has to pay you salvage fees, usually a percentage of the value of the ship and its cargo. If the ship were in fact abandoned, it could be a lucrative payday for the crew of the De Gratia. Of course, however, as a sea captain, Morehouse's first priority was to rescue any human life that might be in danger aboard the ship. If the crew were aboard and in trouble, he had to find out so he could render aid. As the men boarded the Mary Celeste, I can't imagine how spooky it must have been. Here you are in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean as you sail up to some ghost ship, seemingly sailing itself straight at you. You slow down, you come alongside, and no one answers you when you yell. Everything is so quiet. Both ships silent. You hear the creaks and groans of the wood of the ships, the splashing waves, the flapping of untrimmed sails, and just silence. And then the captain orders you to go see what's up. Climbing aboard, you slowly and softly walk across the decks, and you find no one. The men aboard checked the cabins and found most of the crew's belongings were still in place, and the skylights of the cabins were open, and the beds and the floors were soaking wet, likely from all the rain. They checked the hold, and they found full barrels of alcohol. In the end, 1,701 would all be accounted for. They found a portion of the ship's railing was removed, the lifeboat was missing, and they never even found the cat. They searched on and found there to be about 3 feet of water in the holds, not an uncommon amount of water for a ship of this size, but nonetheless suspicious. And they found the pumps were still working, so they knew if they wanted to get the water out of the boat, they probably could. They also found the food stores and water stores to be almost full, apart from what would have been eaten and drank in the month since the Mary Celeste had left New York. The ship's log was intact, and the last entry was from 10 days earlier. Could the ship have been sailing herself for 10 days and just turned up right in front of them? Captain Morehouse sailed alongside the Mary Celeste as his men searched for an answer to the mysterious situation. But the men found nothing. Nothing missing. No signs of a struggle. Nothing stolen by would-be pirates. There was no blood. No notes explaining what happened. Nothing. Scanning the waters, there was no sign of the missing lifeboat or any people to rescue. Had the ship had been at sea by herself for 10 days, the missing lifeboat could be anywhere. Nothing could be done for the crew now, so Morehouse and his crew turned their attention to the salvage of the vessel. Back aboard the De Gratia, they conferred and they decided that they were going to try to get the ship the rest of the way across the Atlantic to Gibraltar, and with that claim their rights to the insurance salvage money. It was agreed that Morehouse, the captain, would stay aboard the De Gratia, but his first mate would take 2 men over to the Mary Celeste. The men were able to get the pumps turned on and the water out of the boat, and they found the spare sails that she carried, and soon after they had the Mary Celeste under full canvas once again, sailing westward toward Gibraltar, just 1 day behind the De Gratia. 3 men were able to save the ship and sail her all the way to port safely, which sailing her that short-handed would have been extremely difficult, let alone repairing anything that was wrong. It's safe to say that the ship was in not too bad a shape when they found her ghosting her way across the ocean some 400 miles from where she should have been. Arriving in Gibraltar, the authorities quickly seized the abandoned ship and began to investigate the claims that the crew were making. The crew underwent depositions and each told their story on how they found the ship intact, with no crew, and her extremely valuable cargo intact. The De Gratia crew had to answer for why the Mary Celeste crew's belongings were all left behind, why no survivors were found, why they would be so lucky as to find an expensive ship full of expensive cargo just floating around in the ocean free for the taking. It all seemed a little too bizarre and convenient for the De Gratia crew. After months of deliberation, the authorities agreed to pay the salvage claim, but not in full. The crew of the De Gratia were only awarded a fraction of what they should have gotten under salvage law, but there was little that they could do about the decision, so they took the money and they moved on. A lot of theories came to light about the disappearance of the crew from the Mary Celeste. Pirates maybe boarded them and took out the crew, throwing them overboard, but nothing was missing, not even the 1,701 barrels of alcohol, so it kind of seemed unlikely. Or maybe they abandoned ship because it was sinking, which is also unlikely because it never actually sunk. It wasn't even obvious that there was any water in the holds until they actually looked inside and checked them, and then 3 men were able to pump out the water and get underway within 24 hours. Or perhaps the crew abandoned the ship and went into hiding in the Azores as they passed by. But they had left their son back in New York, and they left all their stuff on the ship. Also, there was no motive for the Briggs family to do this. They were well respected in the maritime industry, and they stood to gain a lot more by completing the delivery and getting paid, or stealing the ship and going elsewhere. Perhaps it said a mutiny took place, but there were no signs of a struggle, nothing evident, and again, nothing missing. Had the crew mutiny, they likely would have taken the whole ship and sold off the cargo for the big payout. In the end, the simplest answer is usually the right one, and most historians tend to agree what most likely happened, though we'll never actually know for sure. What's sort of assumed is that the problem started with the alcohol on board in the barrels in the ship's hold. Alcohol was one of the most dangerous things that you could transport in the time, not just because of the fire hazard should it leak from the barrels, but also because the wooden barrels it was stored in tended to bleed off a lot of fumes. It was customary to open the ship's holds and hatches any day that was nice enough to have them open, allowing the fumes and the odor to breathe and rise up out of the holds and escape the ship. Locked in there, it would become not only a hazard for the crew breathing the fumes, but also a time bomb just waiting for a spark. As the ship made its way across the Atlantic, the weather warmed and the humidity changed, and the barrels would have bled more and more fumes, undoubtedly causing alarm for the crew, who would smell it and have a hard time breathing around it. And with the rain so persistent, as logged by the De Gratia, opening the hatches was not really an option for the first couple of weeks. It's postulated that the crew, on the first day without rain, opened the hatches to finally vent these holds, and the fumes were so strong, the risk of explosion so high, that they had no choice but to get off the ship one way or another, but not entirely abandon it. They would very quickly reduce sail to slow her down, and remove a piece of the railing so that they could launch the lifeboat. The Briggs family, the crew, the cat included, would board the little lifeboat, but leave it tied to the Mary Celeste with several hundred feet of line, the longest line they had, so they could drift far enough behind the Mary Celeste to not breathe the fumes and not be victim if she did explode, but still be able to pull themselves back to the main ship when it was safe to do so. Now that may seem like a sound plan, given the situation, and if all goes well, it should work, but it leaves a few things to chance. If, for example, the wind started to pick up and the Mary Celeste, still having much of her sails up, would do what sailboats do. She would take the wind and start to run with it, probably downwind, sort of erratically going back and forth with no one at the helm to keep her in control. A ship of this size with a sail plan like this would take off like a freight train in good wind, towing behind her the captain, his wife, their toddler Sophia, and the rest of the crew in the lifeboat. It wouldn't take much speed before the tow rope tied to the lifeboat would start to pull the bow under the waves and swamp the boat. The line would need to be cut. That seems to be the prevailing story of how the Mary Celeste came to be sailing the Atlantic back eastward toward home when she was discovered by the crew of the De Gratia with no crew. But the ship wasn't done, and there was one more shipwreck and insurance scheme in her future. The ship was sold many times in the coming years until the last owner decided it was time to get a payout. He loaded the ship up with worthless cargo and over-insured it, claiming it was a big valuable cargo worth much more than it actually was. And he got the crew to get in on his plan. And it said that some of them were in financially and they would be rewarded, and some of them participated in the plan just because they believed the Mary Celeste needed to be destroyed. A superstitious people. At full canvas, as fast as the old Mary Celeste could muster, they ran her up on a reef, full steam, smashing the hull and rendering it unsalvageable, a total loss. However, her insurer started to investigate when a claim was made and quickly figured out what had happened and, of course, refused to pay. Yet again, fool me once, I'm sure they were thinking. If you like this story and you want to see more, please hit the like button on this video and don't forget to subscribe. And also leave a comment and let me know what you want to see in future videos. This has been another History video, and I will see you next week.